Welcome, everyone. We're thrilled to have you here with us today. I'm Dr. Patrice Torcivia Prusko, Director of Learning Design, Technology, and Media at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And we're pleased that you could join us today for today's HAIL webinar, Recentering Learning, Complexity, Resilience, and Adaptability in Higher Education. And HAIL stands for Harvesting Academic Innovation for Learners. It's a network for higher ed leaders who have demonstrated an awareness of and commitment to experimentation for transformational change. And if you're interested in learning more about the organization, you can feel free to drop us a note or put something in the Q&A, and we will follow up with you on that. And this HAIL conversation is co-sponsored, and we're grateful for this co-sponsorship with the Stanford Digital Education and is included in the Academic Innovation for Public Good series. Before we begin our conversation, I wanted to highlight some details about the format of this program. This is a webinar setup, and so we will be taking questions, and you can put them in the Q&A box, and we will be checking there. And while I do have some questions lined up for our panel today, we really want this to be an interactive conversation. We look forward to your questions, and we really want to hear from and discuss with our community around the topics that are discussed in this book. And the chat is open, so you can engage with others in the audience in the chat. And there are auto-generated captions for this conversation, and you can see them by clicking the Show Captions button. With that, I am pleased to introduce our two panelists today, Maggie Debelius and Joshua Kim, who are both co-editors, along with Eddie Maloney, who was not able to be with us today, of the new book, Recentering Learning, Complexity, Resilience, and Adaptability in Higher Education. And we will, of course, be sharing the link to the book in case any of you would like to check it out, if you haven't already. Maggie is the Senior Director of Faculty Initiatives at the Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship at Georgetown University. She also serves as professor in the English department and in the MA program in Learning Design and Technology. Josh is the Assistant Provost for Online Learning Strategy at Dartmouth College and a Senior Fellow at Georgetown University. He writes the Learning Innovation blog on Inside Higher Ed. So welcome to both of you. We're thrilled to have you join us today. So to get us started, I was really privileged to be one of the book authors of this, or one of the chapter authors of this book. But I'm curious, I never really had that conversation with you of how did the idea for this book come about? Kind of like, what's the origin story of the book? And thinking back to that time, higher ed was in a very tenuous situation with the pandemic, dealing with calls for equity and racial injustice. And was there a moment where you felt the need to create something that not only would be a living memory of like a snapshot in that time, but something that could really help us build on and, rebuild a more human and sustainable future for higher education?
Thanks, Patrice. So like so many of the people on this webinar, starting in March 2020, we just had to kick into high gear at CNDLS, our Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship at Georgetown. We were helping almost 3,000 faculty pivot to remote teaching. So, it was one of the busiest times of my professional career. I had so many friends for whom the pandemic was kind of a little bit of a break because they moved to remote work and they were able to, like take up new hobbies or, make some really delicious recipes. But I was just working crazy hours, as were all of my colleagues, both my colleagues at Georgetown, but colleagues at other institutions as well. So Eddie and I, tried to reach out to some folks at other institutions. Again, some of them are on this webinar. Of course, we talk to Josh all the time. And once the dust started to settle, we realized we actually have to capture some of this work, that even though it was such a busy time and it didn't feel like the right time to be trying to put a book together, it also felt like we couldn't not try to harvest some of what we had learned and hopefully well, we knew that there would be future disruptions, and safe to say, we were right about that. So we wanted to be able to capture some of this.
Yeah. Thanks, Patrice and Maggie. That's great. I just want to say, like, looking at the participants, what a small world we live in. And many of you who are here in today's conversation actually contributed to the book. And Maggie and Eddie and I really tried to bring in a diverse set of folks to have some space to think about and process what was going on. And as Maggie says, look forward. So many of you contributed to the book. Many more of you we know from many of our other networks, whether it's Hale or working together in other connections. It's really interesting how much we know each other and rely on each other. So I think one of the themes of our conversation today, and as Patrice says, we really hope that everyone asks questions and we get a conversation going, is how much we needed to rely on each other, as Maggie said, during this just the terrible time of the pandemic, and how much we lean on each other across institutions. And I think we'll come out of this conversation about how much we need to rely on leaning on each other now when things feel, if possible, even worse than what we were experiencing in 20 and 21.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, that part about building community and having other people in the community to lean on. And I think one of the really great outcomes were relationships that were built and the sharing of resources and things. And before we move on, one of the other things I wanted to ask about Josh and Maggie, I can remember years ago, I had a colleague who said to me, we should just co-edit a book. It's so easy. Everybody else does the hard work. They write the chapters. And I know I've written a few book chapters, and I get the sense that it is not as easy as it looks. And I'm wondering if you could just briefly talk a little bit about the logistics and the experience of putting something like this together.
Well, Patrice, I, like you, foolishly thought, oh, it would be, it's easier to put chapters together than to try to write the whole thing from scratch. But I was foolish, and I've learned that it was a true pleasure to work with all of the authors in the collection. And one of the things that I really loved about it was that there were a few times when we could actually get people together on Zoom. So in previous collections that I have been a part of, I have just submitted my chapter, and I've had communication with the editors of the book, but I haven't necessarily talked to the other contributors. But since we were working on this and getting started during the pandemic, we were all on Zoom all the time. So it just felt like a more natural thing to be in conversation with each other, which I think helped people see, oh, okay, she's talking about this thing, so I should talk about, something that is connected to that, but not repeating it. So that, I will say, was an absolute true pleasure. But just being able to track all of the chapters and make sure that everybody was sort of working on the same timeline and to the same style guide, copy editing standards, tracking all of that and making sure we were able to get feedback to people in a timely manner proved to be just a bigger lift than I thought it would be. But thank God for Josh and Eddie. I can't imagine having done it alone. I don't know, Josh, what did you think?
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things to that. And I think it's a good conversation to have about the mechanics of trying to work with scholarly press or university press and to get out there. First, I just want to say that Maggie had the idea for the book, and she really drove things through. So I think Maggie gets just the lion's share of the credit for bringing this thing into creation. And I think you need someone who is going to run through the walls to make it happen, because it's a long type of process. I think for Eddie and I, it helped that we had done a couple books before with Hopkins Press in Great Britain. So we had an editor that we worked with and a relationship there. It's also true that academic presses don't really like to do edited volumes. They don't sell as well. They're difficult to do. So it was a journey to figure out how we could bring people together, and particularly the community, we wanted to write a book that looked towards the future. I think what really helped get this book launched and greenlit by Hopkins Press was really the authors, Patrice, you, and all your other people writing the essays. That, you know, it's kind of a chicken and egg, but once it was clear that so many people who are really well known in this world, in this kind of alternative education, alt academic, thinking about teaching and have kind of public voices, we're contributing to that. This book, I think it did help get it greenlit, as well as the commitment to bring in, which I think we'll talk about, voices that are not normally heard in these kind of volumes. Our students or people who you know, who are teaching but don't have really the space or time to publish for this kind of academic audience. So I think Maggie and I and Eddie would be happy to talk to anyone who's thinking about, you know, trying to move forward with either a monograph or an edited volume with a university press. I think even though it's a lot of work, what you get out of it in terms of building the network and what you learn, and I think also, while it doesn't help almost any of us with promotion and tenure, as we talk about in the book, I think it's helped us all do things like this. Like, without the book, we wouldn't be in this conversation here. We wouldn't have such strong relationships with so many people. It provides kind of a mechanism to do that.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And I'd like to dig in a little bit more to, you know, the contributors of this book, because of course I was thrilled when you reached out to me about writing a chapter in this book on feminist leadership. And I was really intrigued by the wide range of voices who are represented in this book. And I love in the beginning of the book where you mentioned that a goal of the book was to provide a platform for educators whose voices are not typically heard in the academic medium. And I do think that that's one of the things that makes this book, you know, meaningful and special, especially like in this moment in time. And I'm wondering if you can, you know, talk a little bit more about the process of thinking through who the contributors would be and how you curated that group. But I'd love to really focus in on, you know, especially like in this moment in time, you know, why the voices of people who are in these teaching and learning centers and academic innovation centers, like why it's so important for their voices to be recognized and heard.
Sure. Maggie, should I go first on this one so you don't always have to go?
Yeah, you go first so we can ping pong.
I like listening to what Maggie says. It gives me a chance to think about things, but she's better in the moment. So, Patrice, in terms of, you know, trying to curate the network, I think it was a combination of a pretty high proportion of the authors are people like you. Like, Patrice, how long have we known each other now? Like,
Long time.
long time. And that's, I think, a pretty standard story. But then from like 1 degree of separation, we would often hear like folks would either bring in co-authors to say like I really want to center my graduate students or even undergraduates in the writing and put them up front, or my colleagues who are on staff who don't really get the chance. And we often heard from that initial group of core authors. I think you were one of the people who said, "Oh, you really got to talk to this person," right? Like they really have written and pointed us out. So I think it grew. What surprised us was like people like you said yes, because like when you said yes, you were like doing 1,000,001 things and had to be exhausted. And it's not like the royalties are going to like put an addition to your house, or you're not going to get promoted from doing this. It's like, what are the incentives? But it was amazing the yield of our colleagues who said, I mean, maybe because we're all friends.
Yeah.
And that was kind of unusual. And I think folks, it resonated, that folks were like, yeah, we really need to learn from this moment. If we don't take some time to write down what happened and the lessons we can learn from this crazy time, that we're going to forget it. And we already see our institutions sliding back and re-siloing. And I think the last thing I'll say about this is when you read the book, which speaks to this moment, the issues of social justice run through the book. and that was really quite apparent as we were going through the pandemic. And it would be, if we were trying to do something like this now, like it's probably too soon, and I'm not so sure all of us would be so willing to kind of push ourselves forward and sort of speak for our institutions the way we were at that moment. It's kind of an interesting question. I don't know, Maggie, how would you answer Patrice's question?
Oh, well, let's see. I'm so intrigued by that last point that I'm now losing my answer. But I think to your question about how we put this great group of authors together, for me, teaching has always been a team sport. So I started my career in writing centers, and so I've always been somebody who has been working with other people on their teaching while also doing my own teaching, but it's never been just like the matter of a single professor and her students. I have always just seen my classes as being about collaborations with the library and the teaching center and the writing center and, the people who would help with digital technology, and really trying to incorporate a team from the very beginning, like even at the point at which I was putting my syllabus together, not just kind of waiting until I needed help at the last minute. So learning for me has always been about trying to pull in a variety of really smart people to figure out what to do. And but I don't often see that represented in books. It's usually tenure-line professors who are publishing, because as Josh says, there's an incentive there that you get promoted, and you might get a raise, or you might get all sorts of accolades for it. Whereas a lot of the people that I've worked with on my teaching are not always invited into these conversations. So it was really important, and it became so important, of course, during the pandemic, when we had to make sure that our students even had access to remote learning, that we really had to be good collaborators then. So that was a moment to just really highlight that and bring that to the fore, that we've always needed each other, but more so than ever now.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I agree. And that kind of like brings us into a question from Suzanne Dubb about in what ways have themes from this book, that kind of, came about during the pandemic, evolved in the past, 5 years, and, and really like, how do they apply in this, in this specific moment in time? And I know, some of the themes in the book, of course, had to do with systems and structural changes, things we learned about teaching and learning, and like Josh was saying, a focus on equity, access, and justice. And of course, now we were just talking about, different budget constraints we have, different challenges that our students are having, and the advent of generative AI and AI that's, impacting much of the work we do. And so I'm wondering if you each could just, share a bit about your thoughts about, what people could take from this book, in this specific moment.
Josh, do you want to continue?
Sure. I can, then we can switch. Yeah. We would hope, having gone through just how horrible the pandemic was for all of us and so many of our people in our community and so much of higher ed and our friends and family, that we would be taking those lessons and then be kind of more ready for the place we are now. And like we were talking before this meeting, and we've been kind of preparing for this webinar, and the moment we're in now feels somehow worse. Like it really feels like not only are our institutions under attack, but really the core values that underlie so much of our work are under attack. And particularly as alternative academics, many of us were really motivated that our institutions should support those who are most marginalized by the current structures, and really identify with those learners, and we do everything we can that our universities serve those students who've been traditionally marginalized by the structures. It feels like, okay, this is almost like it's intentional. It's not like sort of this virus that's out there and we're all challenging. This is like we're under attack now, and our core values are under attack. So I think what we need to do is we I think we do hope that folks read the essays in this book and really reflect about, well, how we made it through. And we really did adapt during the pandemic. Like that's one of the themes that we changed. We changed quickly, and we're agile, and we were resilient, and we worked together. And we didn't have a map, but we really figured out some quite wonderful things. I think we need to try to do something similar, but we have to do it like as a community, because we can't just sort of sit back and keep taking the punches. We need to somehow go forward. So that's what's on my mind as we think about the book and the moment we're in now.
Yeah, I agree. And so in answer to Suzanne's question about how the themes have evolved in the past 5 years, so I still stick with and believe more than ever our central argument that what universities need to do in the face of challenges is to really just double down on learning and evidence-based learning, and really invest in what we know works in terms of all kinds of pedagogy. But as we started doing the book and we were inviting people to submit essays, I had one of our awesome graduate students, Joyce Zhao, who helped us with the book, run all of the essays just to analyze the most common words in the text. And I was kind of expecting it to be like Zoom or online or Canvas or something, but actually the most common words in the essays were about relationships and collaboration. And I think that is one thing that that was really important during the pandemic, and it's really important now. And so when I talk about, evidence-based learning or recentering learning, for me, learning is about those relationships that we build with our students, that we build with our colleagues, that we build with, each other across institutions. We just have to really just like join arms in this moment and talk to each other and try to figure out how we can be agile and resilient in the face of some pretty big challenges.
That's great. That's great. And I've been thinking a lot about the, agile and flexible, and certainly like during the pandemic, decisions were made very quickly. And I think some of us wondered like, oh, well, like things move faster within higher ed, where traditionally, it can take years to move an initiative forward, and we don't always move as quickly as some would like. And in order to, just kind of like stay up with things, and being in Cambridge, which is kind of, a center of innovation, I spend a lot of time, in community with members that are, the startups and technology. And I was recently at a fireside chat with the CEO of Perplexity that was hosted at Harvard Business School. And one of the things that really struck me, somebody asked, like what the 3-year roadmap was for Perplexity. And he said, we don't think that far ahead. He said, 3 months is as far as we will plan ahead. And that, if you think about it, in the last 3 months, we've had more change in that area than we have in the last 2 years. And I know that like many of like my colleagues feel like it's just so hard to keep up with the change. And so I'm wondering, in a lot of the discussion, I was at ASU GSV last week, and a lot of the ed tech vendors, a lot of the discussion was about personalization. Here's a quicker way to do your multiple choice questions. And I think, two takeaways I had from that, there's this feeling that, the go-to is like, how can we do the same thing differently? And, with a different tool, as opposed to really taking a step back and imagining, what's our preferred future? How might we like to see assessment or the structures and systems of higher education? And, with respect to personalization, that feels like very siloed and individualized. And I think, one of the chapters in the book talked about the importance of learning design being more of a team sport. And so kind of building on that question of the themes, and, Suzanne was also wondering, like, does it feel like we're coming closer to recentering learning or moving further away?
So I guess I would say some of both. I think that there are some lasting changes that we made from since the pandemic that really do ground us in learning, but then there are ways in which we have already forgotten some of the lessons at a time when we sorely need them. So I'll try to give just small examples to illustrate what I'm thinking. So one thing that I've seen at Georgetown since the pandemic is faculty are much more likely to reach out to students either before classes begin or just as classes begin with a survey about, who their students are and, the different ways in which they have relationships to the course. And it sounds like such a small thing, and it's a relatively, easy lift to send out over email or in Canvas, just do a Google form. But that's something that really started during the pandemic when we weren't sure if our students had great internet access at home, or if they were even in a place where they could easily Zoom into a class. If you're living in an apartment with lots of other people, that's not so easy to do. And so it really came from a place of trying to understand the circumstances of a student's learning, as opposed to, we are a undergrad, at least traditionally residential university. So when I teach first year writing, I kind of know that all my students live in the dorm and get their food at the cafeteria. Like I didn't have to ask those questions before, but I have seen that most of the faculty with whom I work continue to do that kind of outreach at the beginning of the term to really try to get to know their individual students a little bit better. So I would say that that's one element of recentering learning that we have hung on to and, can stand behind. But then there are many other things that we tried to do during the pandemic, and Josh has already mentioned, a focus on social justice and, learning in a really focus, on belonging and making sure underrepresented groups were able to really access our classes. And I fear that some of that has been, the volume is being turned down on that. So I guess I can't say that we are coming closer or further away from recentering learning. I just some of both.
Yeah, I'll try to trail on what Maggie says and try to bring some positive here. And the reason I want to try to bring some positive, I was looking at the participant list again and thinking about all of you. And I think for so many of us in our work, our effectiveness depends on us being internally motivated to do it, because so much is invisible. And when you're working with faculty and you're working with schools to do educational programs, you're not often out front. And so all the million and one things you do are kind of invisible, and you have to be internally motivated that this will really help the learner. So I'll say some positive things that I think since that are talked about in the book and are themes in the book and since they came out. One thing that has certainly grown since the pandemic is more and more of us are working on online and hybrid learning programs. I think we all became a lot more comfortable with these tools that we're on now. We realized, well, we did an emergency switch to remote learning, but we have some capabilities here. We can kind of bring out new programs. So when you do that, you need learning designers, you need media educators, you need people who are experts in you need that team that Maggie was talking about. So I think there's more of us working in this kind of team approach with faculty to develop courses and programs. And that's great because we're bringing in learning science, we're bringing in what we know about instructional design, and I think that's diffusing throughout, it's hard, but I think we're working to diffuse that through our traditional undergraduate courses. The last thing I'll say about that is, I wish people could raise their hands now, but we can't because we're on this webinar. But how many of you are at home right now? Like I am. How many of you are working flexibly or remote or coming to the office? Our jobs are so much more flexible now, and I think we're trying not to have our lives go around our work. We're trying to make our work go around our lives, which is the way it should be, because we all have complicated lives and it makes it a lot more resilient. So I think this flexibility of work is better. We're trying to kind of figure that out as our colleges and universities are just under attack and the financial situation is really challenging. So it's kind of hard to make sense of that. But I wouldn't want to go back to the pre-2020 years. I think we're in a better place than we were, but we just have to remember what got us there and why it is important to have this kind of flexibility.
That's great. Thank you. And I just want to remind everyone to please add your questions to the Q&A, specifically related to the book, wonderings about, community and relationships, and, just what's happening in higher ed in this moment. We'd love to hear your thoughts and have this be a community discussion. And one of the things I was thinking about, Josh and Maggie, in the conversations we're having, and some of the themes from the book, that you made me think of, Josh, when you were talking about like not wanting to go back. There's an analogy that I use sometimes about like refurbishing a home. And when you do that, you want to keep what's good, but redesign maybe what's not still working. And so, for example, when you pull up that linoleum, like sometimes you find beautiful hardwood floors that you couldn't even find today, or sometimes, it's rotted underneath and it needs to be rebuilt. And so, I think about that with respect to, kind of the book chapters and some of the things that we've learned. And when we were talking as we were getting ready for this session, we talked about how sometimes people will talk about this moment as it's an opportunity. This is our opportunity to reimagine and redesign, and that within the context of the lived experiences of our students, our peers, it's hard to use that word opportunity. And it can be hard to stay, what you were saying, Josh, it can be hard to stay courageous and hold true to our values and kind of like hang on to hope. And I'm wondering if you could each share, an example of either how, you are reaching out to your community or building a personal board of directors or whatever the case may be to, support yourself during this time. And if there are any, takeaways from the book that maybe you go back to help you in this moment.
I can start here, and Patrice, I think where I want to take is I want to take your essay and about trying to look at higher education change through a feminist perspective, and to think about all the components in the history of higher education that have structurally disadvantaged women, and how we have to understand those structures in order to change them. And we need to put that out front. I mean, one thing I have seen, Patrice, is that I have seen, I think, an acceleration of women in leadership roles throughout higher education, including you, Patrice, and your leadership, certainly the president of Dartmouth College, and leaving aside some backward sliding we saw in the Ivy League. But overall, as a sociologist, I think that's an important trend. So I do think that the ideas in your essay that you talked about of centering gender and women's leadership and change in higher education, I do see those ideas getting traction, even in this like incredible difficult time where these ideas are under attack. But within our community, I think that that's true. So I found that heartening. I really found your essay inspiring, and I really hope that everyone in this webinar, if you don't pick up this book for any other reason, pick it up to read Patrice's chapter.
Thanks, Josh. And I will add one more chapter that I think that everybody should turn to at this moment. And that's the chapter on hope by Susanna McGowan and Isa Sartez Vega. And Peter Felton has done a lot of great research as well on hope in educational development. I know that for some of us, this can feel like a pretty hopeless time. We're losing funding. Our students, especially our international students, are really in impossible positions. Some of us may be dealing with job losses, either with ourselves or our friends and family. Certainly, zooming in from Washington, D.C., it's a really present concern where I am right now. So just being able to think about ways of maintaining hope in the midst of some really, really challenging times is, I think, an important component of resisting right now.
Thank you. Thanks. And thanks for mentioning my chapter, Josh. I really appreciate that. And I agree. I think that The changes in numbers are important, but it's really kind of a long arc for systemic change, and there's a lot of work to be done. And one of the things that really drew me to the feminist leadership theory was that anyone can embody those principles and values, and it's really about understanding first your own lived experiences. I know each of us come to this discussion with different identities, different lived experiences, and really doing some critical self-reflection about how you come into this space as a leader, and reflecting on, how you can empower others, how you can help amplify voices of others. And I think, one of the really key things right now is around, collectively problem solving and helping to build a coalition that can really lead to change. And so I hope, when I think about the people in my network, which includes both of you, like having those people that can support you and help guide you and help kind of like maintain that hope is really important. But then also thinking about your circle of influence. I know sometimes this seems so big. When people ask me about what action they take, I always say, just like, think about your circle of influence. What's something that you can do there that can shift the story a little bit? And if enough of us do that, we will, we'll see an even greater shift. So we have a question from Brian Alexander. How can we care for our international students when the government is deporting some of them?
So I'll try, but Josh, chime in as well. I mean, I think that there are sort of like specific concrete actions we can take, and then sort of also just larger mindset approaches. On the mindset approaches, it should not be a surprise to hear me say the word relationships again, but I've just been checking in with my students, but kind of checking in a different way. I'm doing a lot more individual check-ins because many of my international students are not comfortable speaking out in a group right now, and I completely know why. And so making sure that I have a chance for just some, individual, sometimes emails, but honestly, I've had the best conversations just one-on-one in my office. So as you say, we all sort of come to this work with different different circumstances and different contexts. And I'm keenly aware of that with our international students. So that's kind of mindset shift, but the individual actions, I was just speaking with a colleague about some efforts to try to find low-cost housing for international students who are planning to go home for the summer, but now don't feel like it's a great idea, a great time to leave the country. So thinking through opportunities for housing and also potential for on-campus employment, because as an international student, it can be really hard to find off-campus work depending on your visa status and your eligibility to work. I've been working with some students to find internships if they have CPT or OPT, but for students for whom that's not an option, like, is there something they can do on campus just to make enough money to live? And could they, live in a dorm for the summer, or just do something to try to be in a, secure place over the summer if their original plans for travel are no longer viable.
Those are great ideas. I just want to thank Brian for both participating in this webinar, and also Brian is one of the contributors to the book. He wrote a fantastic chapter, I think, from COVID-19 to climate change, and there's something after the colon, but it's a fantastic chapter. And certainly Brian's book, Universities on Fire, has really changed how I think about the world. So it's great. Brian, I think you've been centering this question about marginalized students throughout your work, throughout the decades I've known you, and just by asking the question, I think you're continually put it forward in our context, just in the online learning world, which is the world I inhabit. I mean, we've been thinking a lot more. Okay, it's going to get more complicated. It's just the reality for learners to come to our campuses, and we need to grow. If we want to have an impact on the world and reach these learners, we need to figure out how to bring accessible and affordable, high quality education to people where they are if they can't travel. So Patrice, I know that we kind of want to stay away from like the opportunity kind of word because that's just kind of demotivating for us, but that's the reality that we're in now.
The only other thing I would add, I think, is just transparency and sharing of information. I think sometimes it can be confusing about like, is a document real? Has it been signed by a judge? You know, what rights do, different people have to like come on our campus, and like, who should you call? So, I've found that like, just like that sharing of information, of knowing if you're approached by somebody, what should you do? What actions can you take? And then like, where are the support systems available to students, can be really helpful. And then we have another question. This is anonymous. Did you change anything in the way you do work as a result of working on this book and what you learned from it?
I can start here. All right. So I guess I'll answer that question by pointing to another chapter. And so Sean Hobson had co-authored a fantastic chapter in the book about the work of a learning innovation design unit at ASU. And Sean is kind of one of the godfathers of the HAIL network. So many of you, and I think from both reading Sean and his co-authors chapter about how, with a very large institution, how you can be that catalyst for entrepreneurial innovation and kind of move things quickly, and how that actually works from organizational change. I also have to say, Sean wrote his dissertation on this subject, and I think it's one of the things that comes out is, for many of us working in this alternative academic kind of world, we need more grounded scholarly research. And that's one of the things that we've tried to do in the book. Sean's dissertation, his actually work about this. So I recommend that you get in touch with Sean. But I guess to answer your question, or the anonymous question, trying to be a little bit more like ASU and what I've learned from Sean in terms of risk taking and how that's actually okay. And it's actually a greater risk not to try to like take risks and fail sometimes, and then to be able to point to places like ASU. And I think that that's helpful. So again, another reason to buy and read the book is read Sean and his co-author's chapter about how to take some risks at your institution.
Yeah, similarly, I got some really great ideas from chapters colleagues in the book. And I, as we were writing the book, we were still in the throes of supporting faculty who were teaching online. They weren't pivoting, but they were still doing a lot of it. And for me, both Betsy Berry from Wake Forest and Nancy Chick from Rollins had some just really good practical suggestions about how they were working with faculty. And it sounds so obvious in retrospect. I'm a little embarrassed to say it, but I was just coming off of trying to help 3,000 faculty move their courses online, and my eyeballs were bulging out of my head. But in reading Betsy's chapter about how, at Wake Forest, she didn't have a huge teaching center. So they had more of a train the trainer model where, they would work with a couple individuals who would then have, a network and go out to their departments. And it made so much sense. So just to be able to sort of hear from people who were living through the exact same thing that I was living through, a different institutional context, different people, but we were all trying to work toward the same goal, really learned a lot from that. And it was tremendously valuable.
That's great. And I know, when you use the word like hear what other people are going through, it makes me think of change management and just like the importance of making sure people's voices are heard. And I think in this moment, it's more important than ever, as, we're thinking about what changes, we may need to make, is just really making sure you're listening to everyone, the students, the staff, the faculty, and really hearing what they're saying, because that's the only way that we can really get buy-in. And when I think about like academic innovation and change, I always think it's important to really think about maybe who's not with us as well as our evangelists, and really understanding them in shaping their story. And that kind of leads me to a question that Suzanne asked. During the pandemic, some of the changes we needed to make actually opened our eyes to ways we can improve higher ed. Do the attacks we're facing now open up similar aha moments for ways we could change for the better? For example, one idea I've heard a lot more of is to better communicate the value we add to learners and communities. So for example, like as academic innovators, how can we really shape and tell our story to help people understand the value, that we bring, especially in these times of tightened budgets. So anything related to that or anything else that maybe, comes to mind as an aha moment for ways that we could change for the better?
Yeah, Maggie, I can start here. So one of the chapters in the book, which I think is just fantastic, was done by Annie Sadler and Martin Kurzweil and Matthew Raskoff. And Matthew Raskoff is another one of the Hale, the OGs, who we and, all knows. And that chapter, it's a digital education for access and equity, and they talk about a number of ways that universities have played in our communities and as outreach and beyond our traditional students. And they talk about the Ed Equity Lab and the Stanford work to try to work with that amazing organization to reach high school students who would normally not be able to have access to the incredible high quality education that our institutions represented in a way that can help them understand that they are great candidates to go in that path. I think that what that work has done, that chapter, and that it was really influential in certainly my thinking about what's possible reaching out beyond our where we traditionally think of. So Patrice, to answer the question that you asked, I'd point you to that chapter again. Is very, like, the book, I think, gives concrete ideas about how we can kind of get beyond what's right in front of us and try to think about more kind of structural change and outreach. And that's a great example of a chapter.
Yeah, that's great. It reminds me of at a previous conference, I had heard the term poverty of imagination, and how sometimes, like, it's not just higher ed, but we kind of get in our silos, and you've been in this and done the same things the same way for so long. And the recommendation was, to kind of get out of your space, talk to other people, and even, get out of the higher ed space. I think somebody had said, like, how do they do things, at a zoo or at an ed tech startup or different places? So I do think it's really important right now, like you're saying, to really talk with other people. And, I think one of the things that, when you're talking about the chapter on ASU is, I think just like, the ability to be open to taking risk and fail. And I think something we don't like to talk a lot about and share in higher ed is failures. And I think this is a moment where it's really important for us to find spaces where we can share those things so that we can learn from one another and not repeat the same mistakes, and again, really think about how can we collectively solve some of these problems. And, I know, like, it can be scary. I always use an example, and we're not out of the winter yet here in the Northeast, but I always use an example of thinking about, when you're driving in the ice and you slip on the ice, your reaction can be to just slam on the brakes and stop. But instead, what you're really supposed to do, which is really scary, is go into the slide. And so I think in this moment, we have to allow ourselves, to do just that. And then we have, it says, it's not a question, but more of a comment. One of the things that really struck me about this book is that it's not only recenters learning, but brings work in the fields of online and digital learning and academic innovation more generally to the center of the core function of universities. It also brings the voices of those working in traditional CTLs together with those in digital online learning, which is something we don't always see, which I know we talked about a bit and I agree with. Is there anything else that you think each of us here can do to kind of amplify those voices? And again, thinking back to, how do we really communicate our value in this moment?
I guess, and thank you for the comment. That was really part of our
Mhm.
goal, our work. But I think it's a lot of us on this webinar looking at, again, the attendees.
Yeah.
It's a lot of our life's work to try to do this. I think the challenge we have in going forward is we've been pretty good at talking to each other. Like, our networks within our kind of digital learning, CTL, alternative academic,
Mhm.
Hale, like we've done pretty good about building up these sorts of networks, but what we haven't done, I think, well enough is to take these perspectives, which are really run throughout the book, and bring those into the core conversations of higher education. We haven't really crossed that blood-brain barrier between profession and academic disciplines.
Mhm.
And what's needed, I think we think is like we need less blogging, like like less Zooms, and we need more scholarship. And scholarship like has a long runway. It really takes a long time to get published. And we worked on this book for years to get it up and running. And when we say scholarship, we really mean if you read these essays, they're critical. Like they're very critical of what they bring in the theoretical frameworks, they bring in the research. They're a conversation with other people who've written before and across. So I think we need to find ways to kind of turn what we do into a more scholarly activities. I'm not saying it's easy. One of the things we point out in the book is that all the people who wrote, including you, Patrice, kind of wrote in the cracks of your work on like the outside, like weekends, nights, and it that's a challenge. But I do think we need to, if we're going to move forward and center this work, we need to be accepted by the traditional disciplinary the traditional disciplines and scholars within our institution, that what we do is really legitimate.
Agreed.
One of the other things that somebody had asked in the chat or the Q&A, which I'm not sure any of us are necessarily able to answer, but I'll pose the question, is why are universities not collaborating to resist the executive branch's overreach?
So I'll try on that one. As you say, I don't know if any of us can be fully qualified to answer that, but I would say one reason is they're not on this webinar. It's all about relationships, so they need to, they need to tune into that. But I will also say that I'm starting to see some moments of collaboration, and maybe that can be a little bit of the hope that I mentioned earlier. So, Rutgers and trying to get the Big Ten together, and also several of the lawsuits that have been filed against, like stopping grant funding. Those have been collaborations of multiple universities along with ACNU and AAU. So it's not always kind of as powerful or as visible as I want it to be. Like I'm really mad right away and I want to see like tremendous action and all universities banding together and stopping it. But I'm at least seeing some glimmers that it's starting to happen, and I'm hoping that we can find more of that as we continue to face these challenges to higher ed.
Yeah, I mean, I add to that. I mean, I do think that our professional associations for higher ed are trying to advocate on our behalf, and I think our university leaders are doing just a ton. So I actually am more hopeful about what our institutions are doing. I'm more concerned about those around us. The ecosystem that depends on higher education has been completely silent. I mean, I know in my world, I work a ton with companies in the online space, and we talked a little bit about this right before we jumped on the webinar. And Patrice, you were talking about at GSV that like there's all these companies there who are dependent on us for their success, and they've been completely silent as far as we can tell. About the attacks on our universities. So I guess the answer, I feel like more is happening than on the university association and leadership side than is always clear and visible, and less is happening than should be on our partners outside of our institutions.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and something like you said that I observed when I was at ASU GSV last week. And some ideas that, came up, for example, are there ways that, some of these companies can help fill the funding gaps, ways that we can, work together, and, really focusing in on co-design. Like, right now, it feels like, especially some of these bigger companies, they're really designing for corporations, and then this is being pushed on us, and then we're trying to figure out how to retrofit it for our students and deal with the implications on, not just teaching and learning, but mental well-being. We've all heard stories about the impact of it. And so I just, want to stress the importance that like educators and staff, we need to be involved every step of the way. And we really need to push to like have our voice heard and find ways that we can help to co-design some of these tools so that we have, that say. And I know we have about 3 minutes left, and I did want to give Maggie and Josh, each of you, an opportunity to share, something that you would like everyone here to take away from the conversation.
Do you want me to go, Maggie? Okay,
Go ahead.
Thanks. And Patrice gave us this question, let us think about this. I guess what I'm hoping that people take away if you read this book and you're in this webinar, is that is a sense of we are going to get through this time. Like it's really hard, but we are going to make it through the other side. Our institutions have been around for a long time. We are more resilient than we've seen. So our institutions are going to be okay. I worry about the people. I worry about the people, particularly the people who don't have tenure and don't have the kind of protections. And that we just really need to focus, I think, on taking care of each other. Again, it's the theme of the book, but I think now we just have to really take care of, we talked about taking care of the learners. We really have to take care of all of our community now and each other.
I agree. Again, it's all about the relationship. So, I hope we get through this, but the only way we're going to get through it is together. And, so much of this, the collection itself is a collaboration. Josh and Eddie and I were the editors, but if you look at most of the chapters, most of them are co-written. So really thinking of our work and our scholarship is very much collaboration. I know that there was a question about wishing that there were more Black or Latinx voices in this webinar. I wish there were too, 100% I do, but I hope you'll also read the book, because that was something that many of the folks that we were working with were really determined to bring in new voices in the collection. So there are going to be some familiar names who are big deals in the field. Josh mentioned some of those that helped us get the book published, but there are also lots of new up and coming people who are speaking from a whole bunch of perspectives. And as Josh said, sometimes the newer people are the more vulnerable people, but we've got to, continue to lean into the relationships and help, build resilience across people and institutions.
That's right. Thank you so much, Josh and Maggie. And yeah, just to reiterate, I think this is a time we really need to focus in on care, supporting everyone around us, and problem solving together. I really feel, I know Maggie and I were talking before, and we were like, oh, if you find a solution to that problem, please share it with me. And we just really need each other in this moment in time. And so thank you to everyone for joining us today. And if you have any further questions, I think you can feel free to reach out to any of us, and we would be happy to talk with you more.